I work as a principal environmental and community specialist. My main focus is on social and community aspects of projects. So I have quite a varied background in terms of working in different projects, different areas. And also a lot of my work is project managing environmental and social impact assessments, including sort of writing social baseline and social impact assessments. So that's what I want to focus my talk on. So I'm very much looking at the importance of understanding communities through developing an in-depth social baseline during exploration work, so alongside the feasibility study. And it's my belief that without this understanding of how communities function and without adequate consideration of the perceptions of stakeholders and what they have on the project, that companies are far more likely to violate human rights. So when I use the term social baseline, I'm referring to the understanding of communities, how they function and operate. And in order to implement the Ruggie framework to protect, respect and remedy human rights, I'll draw on experiences of what happens at a site level. So some of my own experiences and some second-hand experiences. So as you've already been introduced, human rights apply indiscriminately to everyone and are a set of standards protected as legal rights in national and international law. They're defined by the very definition of sustainability, including civil and political rights, social, economic and cultural rights. So when you look at it in that context, it's easy to see how mining operations can impact or influence human rights. So I'm going to just introduce you to a couple of case studies and focus on sort of my own experiences, which are very much at a site level, working as a consultant. So setting the scene overall, I think it's pretty fair to say that the expectations are getting higher, linked to people's overall increasing awareness of environmental and social issues. So often in the mining industry, people refer to the need for companies to gain and maintain their social license to operate. This is part of sort of general societal expectations that are increasing. And we're all aware of the importance and influence that people's perceptions and that groups of people can have on a project. So to use a quote from an interview I did with a mining company, Imerys, based down in Cornwall and West Devon a few years ago when I was based at the Camborne School of Mines. 30 years ago, people just assumed that the industry created dust and that was part and parcel of living here. People won't accept that now and demand tighter environmental controls. This has been brought on by people moving into the area and thinking, why do we have to put up with this? And I think this sums up well this sort of changing expectations of society. So overall, I wanted to sort of focus a little bit on why things are changing. And I think it's fair to say that technology is changing the world, and conversely, the world is driving changes in technology. This, to me, is one of the key factors driving change today, raising people's awareness of what is going on in the world, influencing who, what, and how people view companies and projects. And this diagram sort of overall, I think, shows fairly well that the world is now a much smaller place. Access to internet overall and use of social media is increasing. And estimates based on sort of, World Bank figures suggest that a quarter of people in the world back in 2013 used social media at some point. And global internet penetration is now very high, and based on sort of World Bank figures, is at 36%. So on this basis, it's hardly surprising that companies now have a social media that many companies now have a social media presence and actively monitor social media as a way of gaining feedback on a project and assessing whether a project has gained and is maintaining its social license to operate. Social media platforms have impacted how business to society relations exist through the development of new information exchange mechanisms. The increased usage of the internet and social media make it much easier to transfer information at the touch of a button. What I want to go on now is presenting my two different case studies and touching on a few other examples. These case studies differ based on scale, geography and outcomes. Despite the differences in these examples, to me, the solution is directly related to gaining a thorough understanding of the history of a site from a socio-political context and from having early and regular communication with stakeholders. Part of the answer is regular monitoring to assess changes to the social baseline over time as a project becomes operational, and from maintaining effective management of a project. This includes gaining an understanding of cultural legacies and the modern day implications they have. Because I often find when I'm out on site that I have discussions with local people, and I get told a lot of information that wouldn't necessarily make it through to companies directly. I might get told, things like the company is driving too fast through our village, I'm worried about my children, but I don't want to mention it to the company because my husband works for them. So, there's lots of different scenarios that I get, and part of, I think, the importance of my role is making sure that this is fed back to the company so the right people can deal and manage with potential sort of issues like that could grow into sort of larger problems. I think it's important to not let the small issues become larger problems over time. So, going into my first case study is Lonmin, the Maracana site, what happened back in August 2012. And I'm sure I don't need to sort of introduce all of you too much to this. And I'm sure everyone knows that over the period of a few weeks, 44 people were killed, including 34 miners shot dead in one incident by the police. Strike season, as it is referred to in South Africa, happens more or less on an annual basis. And that year, the strike season had a severe effect on the mining, construction and automobile industries. Unions were asking for high pay demands at a time when companies were struggling based on falling metal prices. The Confederation of South African Trade Unions affiliate union, the National Union of Mine Workers, were seeking a 60% pay rise, whereas other unions were seeking up to 150%. And this would be the equivalent of taking salaries up to 12,500 rand, which is about equivalent of £700. And at this point, I would like to consider sort of how mining companies operate in South Africa. So they tend to take a sort of less mechanised approach and use more employees to projects compared to other projects in, say, Canada or the US, for example. So at sites that operate in this manner, to ensure operations remain profitable, there is a balance between mechanisation and personnel employed on site. To pay everyone considerably higher salaries would only be possible with further sort of mechanisation of technology, which would obviously involve the sort of retrenchment of large numbers of personnel. So everything is a balance. And during the strikes, management were staunchly sticking to their offer of a 6.5% wage increase, contributing overall to the instability and volatility of the situation. Just to use another quote, to quote a director of the International Labour Organisation in South Africa, on his perception of what was happening at the time, they seemed to be like rabbits in headlights, not knowing whether to move left or to move right, and waiting to see how the unions play out against each other, which made it very dangerous. Management seems to have rested on their laurels and said, okay, for social dialogue, we need to focus on it only when we do our wage bargaining. This isn't the case because poverty levels and the wage gap is so high that it's going to be continually on the agenda in South Africa. So just looking at that a bit more, this slide shows you median salaries and mean salaries. And overall, putting it in context, the mean salary in South Africa is around 8,500 rand, but the median salary is 2,800 rand. This infers overall that a much smaller proportion of people are on larger salaries, effectively raising the overall mean salary and masking discrepancies and inequalities that reflect the wider sort of social disparities that still exist within the country. So overall, what happened here reflects many different failings relating both to the management of the police force and the failure to understand the implications of historic political legacies and existing inequalities within the country. This happened in a country which experiences regular annual strike seasons and walkouts of employees. This situation should have had responses and appropriate crisis management solutions embedded within the management systems operating at the site. Understanding and adequately accounting for stakeholder perceptions of the project is essential to avoid this happening again. Had the policemen been better trained in handling this situation, would Marikana have happened? The challenge to me is in assessing the sort of wider influences on a project and thinking sort of what can be put in place to avoid tragic situations like Marikana happening again. I just wanted to touch on the ongoing conflicts within the Central African Republic. Just briefly touch on this example. And Michael referred to this earlier about the EU are looking at establishing conflict mineral legislation relating to the minerals trade in that region. And so far, my understanding that this has received very mixed reactions relating to the complexity of supply chain due diligence, which, as shown by the US Dodd-Frank Act, can be costly and difficult to enforce. The Dodd-Frank Act requires certain companies regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission to disclose whether their products rely on conflict minerals, looking at tin, tantalum, tungsten and gold, and within the countries bordering the DRC. This act was aimed at promoting peace and security in these regions to ensure mineral trade is not financing armed groups operating in that region. Any EU legislation would have to sort of balance similar requirements, and the ongoing conflict in the Central African Republic, I think, is likely to sort of reignite questions relating to conflict minerals and the value of assessing supply chains to ensure responsible sourcing of metals. Increased awareness through changes in technology as internet and social media usage increases will continue to act as a driving force for change within this area. Now, going back to a case study I know very well on an ESIA I project managed on a small gold project in Kazakhstan, and sort of drawing on my own experiences of what protect, respect and remedy meant to villagers of the closest community to the project site. To provide you with a general context of the site, previous operators had sold the site multiple times, and this had led to issues relating to sort of trust and the community. And this was a major hurdle, really, for the new operator. Right as they bought the site, they had to deal with people's perceptions and sort of lack of trust as to what was going to happen. To use this quote that was taken during one of my visits from what a local person said to me, and I think it sums it up quite well, the sort of lack of trust in the community. People who work for the mining company, once the mine closes, you will have made your money. We'll be left with the environment you leave behind, and what will happen to our community when the jobs go. So similar to what I think should have happened at Maracana, it's important to look at the wider history of the site and project area, as this is fundamental in sort of developing people's mindsets and opinions of a project. And I think this quote also emphasises how human rights are so interconnected with social and environmental aspects. So in terms of people have discussed in other talks about, you know, viewing it, integrating it within human rights within an environmental and social assessment. One of the most important things I attempt to do whenever I'm working on a project is to try and sort of identify the concerns of local people at a very early stage. So during my sort of many site visits that I made for this project, I think I went out there about 5 or 6 times within a year. I got to know local people really well and got a good understanding of their perspectives of the project and what issues they were really concerned about. And the picture on the left shows a grave that local people took me to, which was on the edge of the licence area. And this was adjacent to where a water pipeline was going to come in alongside the grave. And based on sort of consultation with local people and agreement with the company, we worked developing a cultural heritage management plan and agreeing that the water pipeline would be moved to enable local people to continue to access the graves. And I think this was really, you know, this was really important to them. And we managed to sort of work together to get some sort of agreement that meant they could access the graves whenever they wanted. And the picture on the right shows a lake, and you might be puzzled what the top picture is. It's dried fish, and fisheries in this area were really important to people's livelihoods, both in terms of, I mean, there were legal and illegal sort of fishers operating in the area. So given the historic development and general lack of trust, the new company had hurdles to overcome straight from the start. From my perspective, one element that I found was critical in supporting my work at the site was emphasising to local people that I worked independently. I was doing the environmental and social impact assessment, and whenever I sort of go to a site, I always try to sort of visit and speak to people without preconceived ideas, trying to see the challenges through their eyes. So, you know, what does it mean at a ground level to them? So I found out the most about the community and about how the community operated and functioned after I started to sort of gain the trust of the local people. And this picture shows a festival called Nowruz, which is celebrated in Kazakhstan in March to celebrate spring. And they like kill some animals, and it's like a party time. You have you have like big chunks of meat on the tables and people sharing. And I very much enjoyed attending this and talking to local people, even as a vegetarian. So to me, trust is particularly important in a country like Kazakhstan that has been compliant to the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative since 2011. And I think EITI will be particularly important in terms of enhancing transparency and reducing sort of issues and perceptions people have relating to corruption within the country. And just touching on sort of grievance mechanisms, which have been mentioned there, one of the key components in establishing trust lies in having an accessible and usable grievance mechanism operating at the site. And I think this is difficult to achieve in a former Soviet country where people's perceptions are that they're going to get some sort of reprisal if they make a formal grievance. And just briefly touching on, whilst I think public consultation is essential part of the sort of environmental and social impact assessment, and as the project progresses, I think it's a lot of the interesting bits of information you get along the way. And I think failure to understand the historic context, existing legacies, and their socio-political implications in the current day poses risks to human rights and can manifest, as you've seen by my case studies, or at different scales and severities. And I mean, the site in Kazakhstan that I worked on, I was looking at more from the perspective of potential human rights issues that could come up if they weren't addressed. So integrating human rights aspects into management systems is essential, but policies and standards need to support change to corporate culture at an operational level through establishing and monitoring performance indicators from the social baseline and through having a fully functioning grievance mechanism. And I think one of the critical elements to this is that changes that are introduced must have buy-in from the top level of companies to be credible at the ground level and to get sort of buy-in right the way through. And I think the recent example of the IFC financed palm oil plantations project in Honduras, which I'm sure some of you will be aware of, there's been quite a lot of controversy relating to alleged forced evictions. And I think this shows the complexity of transferring the theory of management plans and systems into the reality of what actually happens on a site level. And successfully implementing the UN Guiding Principles requires an adequate understanding of the historic and cultural implications of a site, embedding this understanding into management systems, and also listening and understanding what is happening at a ground level with employees and stakeholders, including local people. And I think this is essential to address within the human rights agenda in general. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it.